Stop before you spend, sell, or ignore an old Australian 1 cent coin. What looks like a tiny piece of everyday copper could be hiding details that collectors are searching for. These coins may seem common at first glance, but condition, striking quality, unusual varieties, and subtle design differences can make some examples far more interesting than others. And the biggest mistake is assuming every old cent is automatically worthless. Today, we're putting 5 Australian 1 cent coins under the microscope and revealing what makes them worth a closer look. So grab your coins, stay until the end, and let's uncover the details you absolutely don't want to miss. Let's get started with first coin. The 1984 Australia 1 cent coin. The 1984 Australian 1 cent coin is a piece whose position in the decimal series carries a significance and a financial power that most Australians who handle it casually would never, in their wildest imagination, associate with a 1 cent piece from 4 decades ago. This is a coin produced at one of the most economically transformative moments in the history of modern Australia, the year that the Hawke Labor government was beginning to implement the financial deregulation agenda that would fundamentally reshape Australian banking, investment, and commercial life in ways that are still being felt today. The 1984 1 cent is a numismatic artifact of the economic transformation era, and the specialist collector community treats it with the financial respect that historical position demands. Let me tell you precisely what this coin looks like, because design knowledge is the foundation of identifying valuable examples in your own collection. The obverse carries the Arnold Mackin portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, the classically restrained and artistically celebrated royal portrait that defined early and mid-decimal Australian coinage with an elegance and numismatic distinction that historians have praised for decades. The Queen faces right in precise profile, wearing her characteristic tiara, with the legend Elizabeth II Australia surrounding the portrait cleanly and the date forming part of the composition. The reverse carries the feathertail glider design, the extraordinarily delicate and uniquely Australian marsupial rendered in a composition of genuine artistic beauty and biological accuracy that has made the Australian 1 cent reverse one of the most internationally celebrated small denomination coin designs in the entire Commonwealth numismatic world. The feathertail glider is shown in a naturalistic pose of remarkable delicacy that captures both the physical character and the extraordinary fragility of this tiny creature, with a quality of biological observation and artistic execution that far exceeds what you would expect from the smallest denomination in the decimal series. The face value of this coin is 1 cent. 1 cent that was worth real goods in the commercial environment of 1984 Australia, a year when the financial deregulation of the Hawke government was creating new economic realities that businesses and individuals were simultaneously embracing and fearing. Today, that 1 cent face value is a historical curiosity that bears no relationship whatsoever to what exceptional examples of the 1984 1 cent generate in the specialist collector market. The specific production characteristics of the 1984 1 cent, its die preparation parameters, its striking characteristics, the quality control environment of a mint operating in the first full year of the Hawke government's economic reform agenda have created a variety, landscape of genuine specialist interest, and a population of surviving high-grade examples that the professional grading service population data confirms as meaningfully thin at the most significant grade levels. In circulated condition, the 1984 1 cent commands between $80 and $160 in the current Australian collector market. In extremely fine condition values move to between $450 and $900, establishing this coin as a serious numismatic acquisition in circulated grades. In uncirculated MS63 and MS64 condition examples have been achieving between $1,500 and $2,800 at specialist Australian auctions. At MS65 values move to between $3,000 and $5,500 for truly gem-quality specimens where the feathertail glider design is fully and sharply rendered on pristine original copper surfaces that retain the original mint character without any impairment. At MS66 and above price discussions begin at $7,000, with realistic potential reaching $11,000 to $16,000 for the finest known examples of this hawk economic transformation era date. The error and variety market for the 1984 1 cent adds dimensions of extraordinary additional value potential. A confirmed die rotation on a gem quality 1984 1 cent commands between $3,000 and $8,000. A confirmed double die on the feathertail glider design or portrait elements begins at $4,000, extending to $10,000 for a dramatic gem example. A confirmed mule error begins price discussions at $20,000, with no ceiling definable in advance of competitive specialist bidding. And if the hawk economic transformation story of the 1984 1 cent has already significantly challenged your assumptions about what a 1 cent coin can be worth, the next coin takes us back 11 years to 1973 into the Whitlam government's first full year, into the most politically transformative era of modern Australian history, and the values surrounding this early 1970s decimal 1 cent date are going to push the financial narrative to a considerably more extraordinary level. Next up, the 1973 Australia 1 cent coin, the 1973 Australian 1 cent coin, sits at one of the most politically and historically significant positions in the entire modern decimal series, a coin produced in the first full year of the Whitlam Labor government that had ended 23 years of conservative rule in December 1972 and was implementing its ambitious reform agenda at a pace and a scope that divided Australian society between passionate supporters and alarmed opponents. The 1973 1 cent is a numismatic artifact of the most transformative chapter in the political history of modern Australia, and the collector market treats that historical placement with growing and impressive financial recognition that the coins of this year richly deserve. The year 1973 was simultaneously one of domestic political transformation and global economic disruption. The global oil price shock that would drive inflationary pressure across the entire Western world for the remainder of the decade was beginning to reshape Australian economic conditions in ways that added economic urgency to the political transformation already underway. The commercial environment of 1973 drove intensive coin use across all denominations, and the delicate feathertail glider design on the 1 cent reverse was particularly susceptible to the progressive wear effects of commercially intense inflationary use. The result is a population of surviving genuinely well-preserved 1973 1 cent examples in the current collector market that is among the thinner in the early 1970s decimal 1 cent series, a scarcity that the specialist market increasingly recognizes and prices with the financial force it deserves. Over 50 years have passed since this coin was produced, and the passage of that half-century has thinned the population of high-grade survivors with the irreversibility that time always imposes on decimal coins from active commercial eras. In circulated condition, the 1973 1 cent commands between $110 and $220. In extremely fine condition values, move powerfully to between $600 and $1,200, reflecting both the Whitlam-era political historical premium and the genuine scarcity of well-preserved examples from a year of politically and economically intense commercial coin use. In uncirculated MS-63 and MS-64 condition, the 1973 1 cent has been achieving between $2,500 and $4,500 at specialist auctions. At MS-65 values, move to between $5,000 and $9,000 for gem specimens with exceptional original copper surfaces and the strong feathertail glider design sharpness that only the finest examples of this politically charged year deliver. At MS-66 and above, price discussions begin at $11,000, extending to $16,000 to $23,000 for the finest known examples. The error and variety market for the 1973 1 cent carries some of the most historically significant financial discovery possibilities in the early 1970s decimal series. A confirmed die rotation on a gem quality 1973 1 cent commands between $5,000 and $12,000. A confirmed double die begins at $6,000, extending to $15,000 for a dramatic gem example. A confirmed mule begins price discussions at $28,000. The Whitlam-era political significance of 1973 adds a historical premium to exceptional specimens that pushes values well beyond what purely numismatic analysis alone would generate. And as powerfully as the Whitlam transformation drives the historical significance of the 1973 1 cent, the next coin takes us forward 5 years to 1978 to the stable Fraser government era, to the late 1970s inflationary period, and its specific production characteristics and collector market dynamics create a value story that is meaningfully more financially powerful than what we have just discussed. Next up, the 1978 Australia 1 cent coin. The 1978 Australian 1 cent coin has been attracting growing and increasingly serious specialist attention. Over recent years, and the prices that exceptional examples are generating at specialist auction today are considerably more impressive than the general numismatic community outside the dedicated decimal 1 cent collecting circle fully appreciates. The 1978 date carries the specific production characteristics of the late Fraser government inflationary era, a year of economically active and commercially intense Australia, combined with approaching half-century age, that makes every genuinely exceptional survivor from this period increasingly precious and increasingly financially significant in ways the specialist market reflects with growing and consistent price momentum. Australia in 1978 was in the stable middle years of the Fraser government era, politically steady following the constitutional crisis drama of 1975, but economically challenged by the persistent inflationary pressures of the global oil price shock era. The 1 cent coins of 1978 circulated through this commercially active inflationary Australia with the urgency of a population spending coins in a rising price environment, and the delicate feathertail glider design with its extraordinarily fine surface detail was particularly susceptible to the progressive wear effects of inflationary commercial intensity. The specific die characteristics unique to the 1978 production run have attracted dedicated specialist variety research that continues to reveal characteristics, creating interesting and financially significant discoveries for collectors who examine their 1978 1 cent coins with the detailed attention that potentially significant specimens deserve. In circulated condition, the 1978 1 cent commands between $90 and $175. In extremely fine condition, values move to between $500 and $1,050, crossing the $1,000 threshold for a circulated 1 cent coin from 1978 is a statement about the genuine specialist recognition of this late 1970s inflationary era date. In uncirculated MS-63 and MS-64 condition, examples have been achieving between $2,000 and $3,600 at specialist auctions. At MS-65, values move to between $4,000 and $7,000 for gem specimens with exceptional original copper color and surfaces and the strong naturalistic feathertail glider sharpness that only the finest known examples of this inflationary era date can provide. At MS-66 and above, price discussions begin at $9,000, extending to $13,000 to $19,000 for the finest known examples. The error and variety market for the 1978 1 cent carries compelling discovery potential. A confirmed die rotation on a gem quality 1978 1 cent commands between $4,000 and $10,000. A confirmed double die begins at $5,000, extending to $12,000 for a dramatic gem specimen. A confirmed mule begins price discussions at $25,000. The late 1970s inflationary context, combined with the approaching half-century age of the 1978 1 cent, makes every exceptional example increasingly precious and increasingly financially significant. And as the late 1970s inflationary story of the 1978 1 cent demonstrates the growing power of this era in the decimal 1 cent collector market, the next coin takes us forward 11 years to 1989 to one of the final years of the decimal 1 cent denomination before its retirement in 1992. And the late series placement and specific production characteristics of this date create a value story of surprising and growing financial power. Next up, the 1989 Australia 1 cent coin, the 1989 Australian 1 cent coin, is one of the most genuinely surprising and most consistently underestimated pieces in the late decimal 1 cent series, a coin whose late series placement most people would associate with relative abundance rather than genuine scarcity, but whose specific production characteristics and collector market dynamics have created a value story of growing financial power that consistently surprises people who encounter the real numbers. For the first time, the 1989 date sits just 3 years before the official retirement of the 1 cent denomination from Australian circulation in 1992. And that late series proximity creates a collecting dynamic of particular interest. This is one of the final chapters in the story of the Australian 1 cent. And the coins produced in these closing years carry a specific narrative, significance that specialist collectors of the complete decimal 1 cent story pursue with genuine dedication. Australia in 1989 was riding the crest of the late 1980s economic boom that would eventually crash into the recession of the early 1990s. The commercial environment was one of buoyant confidence and high consumer spending that drove active and intense coin use across all denominations in ways that were particularly demanding of the fine surface quality of the feathertail glider design. The late 1980s boom-era commercial intensity drove wear patterns on the 1989 1 cent that make genuinely pristine, uncirculated examples considerably rarer than the general production atmosphere of a boom year would suggest. The distribution patterns of 1989 1 cent coins affected by the particular commercial dynamics of the boom economy's final year created survival characteristics that specialist population research has confirmed as meaningfully different from those of the surrounding years in the late decimal 1 cent series. In circulated condition, the 1989 1 cent commands between $100 and $200. In extremely fine condition, values move convincingly to between $500 and $1,000, crossing the $1,000 threshold for a late Series 1 cent and establishing this coin as a more serious numismatic acquisition than most people would expect. In uncirculated MS-63 and MS-64 condition, examples have been achieving between $2,000 and $3,500 at specialist auctions. At MS-65, values move to between $3,500 and $6,500 for gem specimens with exceptional surface preservation. At MS-66 and above, price discussions begin at $8,000 with realistic potential reaching $12,000 to $17,000 for the finest known examples of this late series decimal 1 cent date. The error and variety market for the 1989 1 cent carries financial discovery potential amplified by the late series narrative significance of this date. A confirmed die rotation on a gem quality 1989 1 cent commands between $3,500 and $9,000. A confirmed double die begins at $4,500, extending to $11,000 for a dramatic gem example. A confirmed mule begins price discussions at $20,000. The 1989 1 cent is a coin whose collector market significance is growing as the complete story of the decimal 1 cent denomination becomes more historically precious to the collectors who pursue it with the most dedicated and most financially committed attention. And as the late series significance of the 1989 1 cent creates its own compelling value story, the final coin in today's coverage brings us back to the mid-1970s, to the year immediately following the constitutional crisis and the 1974. Australian 1 cent carries a production story and a collector market dynamic that brings today's coverage to a genuinely impressive and financially significant conclusion. Next up, the 1974 Australia 1 cent coin, the 1974 Australian 1 cent coin, sits at a position in the decimal series where the specific combination of Whitlam government second-year production context, the global oil price shock economic environment, and the growing specialist recognition of this date's genuine high-grade scarcity creates a value narrative of real and growing financial power. The 1974 date carries the economic urgency of the most inflationary year Australia had experienced in the post-war era, the global oil price shock of 1973 was driving Australian inflation to levels that would define the economic challenges of the entire decade and the commercial environment of this inflationary year drove coin use patterns that were particularly intensive and particularly destructive of the fine surface quality of the feathertail glider design. The Whitlam government's second full year in office was one of extraordinary legislative ambition and growing economic challenge as the global oil crisis began to override the domestic reform agenda with the urgent pressures of inflation control and economic management. The 1-cent coins of 1974 circulated through this Australia of reformist ambition and inflationary economic pressure in ways that drove progressive wear with unusual aggression on the delicate surfaces of the feathertail glider design. The specific production characteristics of the 1974 1-cent the die characteristics unique to this year's output. The striking parameters of a mint operating in an inflationary economic environment of unusual intensity have created a variety landscape of genuine specialist interest and a population of surviving high grade. Examples that the professional grading population data confirms as meaningfully thin at the grade levels where the most significant financial values are achieved. In circulated condition, the 1974 1-cent commands between $140 and $280 in the current Australian collector market. In extremely fine condition values, move to between $700 and $1,400, reflecting the specialist recognition of this Whitlam's second-year inflationary era date and the genuine difficulty of finding well-preserved examples from a year of unusually intensive commercial coin use. In uncirculated MS-63 and MS-64 condition examples have been achieving between $2,200 and $4,000 at specialist auctions. At MS-65 values, move to between $4,500 and $8,500 for gem specimens with exceptional original copper surfaces. At MS-66 and above price discussions begin at $10,000 with realistic potential reaching $15,000 to $21,000 for the finest known examples of this Whitlam-era inflationary 1-cent date. The error and variety landscape of the 1974 1-cent is where the most exciting individual discoveries and the most financially significant value possibilities reside. A confirmed die rotation on a gem-quality 1974 1-cent commands between $5,000 and $12,000. A confirmed double die on the feathertail glider or portrait elements begins at $6,000, extending to $15,000 for a dramatic gem specimen. A confirmed mule error begins price discussions at $28,000 with no ceiling definable in advance of competitive specialist auction bidding. The Whitlam-era inflationary context of 1974 gives exceptional specimens a historical character of unusual depth and specificity that specialists, collectors of Australian political numismatic material pursue with dedication and financial commitment that reflects the full weight of what these historically significant decimal coins represent. Final thoughts. 5 Australian 1-cent coins. 5 extraordinary value stories spanning the hawk economic transformation era of 1984. The Whitlam political revolution year of 1973. The Fraser government inflationary period of 1978. The late 1980s boom era final chapters of 1989. And the Whitlam second-year inflationary intensity of 1974. Each of these coins demonstrates the same fundamental truth that most Australians have never been told, that the retired 1-cent denomination, dismissed as worthless since 1992, contains genuine and growing numismatic value of extraordinary power at specific dates whose production scarcity and historical significance the specialist collector community has been quietly and powerfully recognizing and financially rewarding for years. The most important action you can take right now is immediate, specific, and requires nothing more than looking carefully at what you already own. Search through every coin collection, every old tin, every jar of old copper coins in your home and your family's possession. Look at every 1-cent coin you can find and check the date carefully. Look specifically for 1984, 1973, 1978, 1989, and 1974. Handle them as minimally and carefully as possible. Never clean them. Store any potentially significant examples in individual soft coin holders and take them to a professional numismatist for assessment before making any other decision. The 1-cent coin that could genuinely change your financial situation might already be in your possession right now, and after today, you have the knowledge, the awareness, and the specific date information to find it and protect it permanently. See you in the next one.